Tokyo, December 1941. The winter sky above the Imperial Palace was pale and silent, but inside the War Ministry the air vibrated with triumph and tension. Pearl Harbor had been struck just days before. Japan's flag flew over Hong Kong and Malaya. Newspapers screamed of destiny fulfilled. The Empire believed it had humiliated the West and avenged decades of embargoes and insults. But behind the closed paper screens of the Imperial General Staff, one man sat in uneasy silence. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, the reluctant architect of that very victory. He should have been a hero. Instead, he looked exhausted, chain-smoking in the dim glow of an ashtray. Around him, generals argued over maps, their voices rising with ambition. Next, we must strike Hawaii again. Perhaps even the American mainland. Others spoke of marching into India, of slicing through the Pacific like a blade. Yet Yamamoto said nothing. When the room finally fell quiet, he lifted his gaze. "Gentlemen," he began softly, "you are planning a war we cannot win." The silence that followed was heavier than the winter air. Many of the officers present despised Yamamoto's caution. They saw him as too westernized a man who had studied at Harvard, who had lived among Americans, even played poker with their naval officers. He had been Japan's naval attaché in Washington, D.C., dined in Boston hotels and toured factories that never seemed to sleep. He spoke fluent English, and worse in their eyes admired American ingenuity. They didn't understand that his admiration was not affection. It was fear wrapped in respect. Years earlier, as a young attaché, Yamamoto had travelled across the United States by train from New York's steel canyons to the wheat fields of Kansas, from the shipyards of Seattle to the ranches of Texas. He had watched the endless factories humming through the night, spewing smoke and thunder like living beasts. He'd stood inside Ford's assembly line and watched a car born every 90 seconds. To him, it was not just efficiency, it was civilization, as machinery power distributed among ordinary people. Now, as his fellow officers dreamed aloud of conquest, those images returned with disturbing clarity. He remembered sitting in a Boston tavern beside a young American lieutenant who'd just returned from deer hunting in Vermont. The man spoke casually of his family's 3 rifles, one for him, one for his wife, and one for his teenage daughter. Yamamoto had smiled politely at the time, but he never forgot that tone of normalcy, as though owning weapons, practicing aim, and defending one's home was simply part of being American. In Tokyo, no one seemed to grasp what that meant. Admiral, said General Tojo, narrowing his eyes, "Our men fight with the spirit of the samurai. The Americans are soft. They live in comfort. They will crumble when their ports burn." Yamamoto exhaled smoke slowly. "You mistake comfort for weakness," he said. "I have seen their schools, their factories, their farms. They are not soft. They are self-reliant. Their strength is not in their army, but in their people." The general shifted uneasily. He could see they didn't understand. They believed war was decided by fleets, aircraft, and courage. But Yamamoto had spent enough time studying the enemy to know that the true weapon of America lay hidden not in steel or gunpowder, but in culture. During his years in the US, he'd observed something quietly terrifying: a society that had mechanized determination. Their universities turned engineers into soldiers of industry. Their farms produced as reliably as their assembly lines. Even their children were trained to solve problems and improvise. America's democracy was chaotic, yes, but in that chaos was a power Japan had never mastered: individual initiative. To the imperial mind, order flowed downward: emperor-general, soldier-citizen. In America, it moved upward. Every farmer, every mechanic, every woman riveting metal in a Detroit workshop was part of a national engine that could roar awake overnight, that Yamamoto realized was the sleeping giant. He stubbed his cigarette against the ashtray and spoke again. "We have awakened a nation that believes it cannot be conquered because each man believes his home is his fortress. That is what you do not understand." No one replied. The general stared at him as if he had spoken blasphemy. Outside, the city glowed with victory lanterns and patriotic songs drifted through the cold night. But in Yamamoto's mind, he already saw another fire: the glow of American furnaces lighting up the continent, the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh forging vengeance faster than any empire could imagine. He rose, gathered the reports before him, and said quietly, "Enjoy your celebration while you can. The next battle will not be decided by spirit, but by production, and by a people who have already built the tools to fight back." When he left the chamber, the others resumed their confident chatter, but something in the air had changed. A faint unease lingered like the smell of gunpowder after a shot. Yamamoto walked out into the bitter December wind. Across the palace moat, the lights of Tokyo flickered like the embers of an illusion. He looked up at the pale moon and thought of the long railroad stretching across the American plains, the faces of workers in oil-stained caps, the glint of sunlight on a child's hunting rifle. Japan had struck first, but in his heart Yamamoto already feared that the empire had struck something far more dangerous, the very soul of a nation built never to yield. The next morning, as the generals gathered once again in the Tokyo war room, Yamamoto arrived with a folder thick with papers and photographs. His uniform was immaculate, but his expression was grim, the look of a man who had already seen the future and didn't like it. He laid the folder on the table and opened it without ceremony. Out spilled black and white photographs, not of ships nor of soldiers, but of families. Men in flannel shirts beside barns, women in aprons cleaning rifles on wooden porches, teenagers smiling as they posed with deer antlers and bolt-action guns. The generals frowned in confusion. These, Yamamoto said quietly, are the people you believe will surrender once their navy is sunk. He spread another photograph, a crowd outside a hardware store in Kansas. Rows of rifles lined the display window beside barrels of nails and sacks of grain. Every town, he said, has such a store. Every one, the officers murmured. One chuckled nervously. So what, Admiral? They are hunters, not soldiers. Yamamoto ignored him. He began to speak not like a strategist, but like a witness giving testimony. In the years I lived among them, he said, I travelled from Boston to San Antonio, from Chicago's smoke to the wheat plains. I saw something that no report could describe. Every home, every small town carried within it a weapon, sometimes several. But it was more than metal and powder. It was an idea. He leaned forward, his voice tightening. Their rifles are symbols of independence, of self-rule, of the belief that no one, not even their own government, may take away their right to defend their home. He paused, letting the words settle. One of the staff officers glanced at the pictures again. A boy, maybe 12, aiming a .22 rifle at tin cans stacked on a fence post. Even children, he asked. Yamamoto nodded, especially children. They learn early. Their fathers teach them to aim as they teach them to read. At fairs, they hold shooting contests. I once visited a county festival in Illinois. There were pies music and a marksmanship booth where boys and girls won prizes for accuracy. The smell of gun oil mixed with popcorn. He gave a faint smile. It is a carnival of precision. The room was silent, now filled with the soft rustle of paper and the faint hiss of a kerosene heater. Yamamoto continued. In New England, I met shopkeepers who kept shotguns beneath their counters. On the Texas border, ranchers rode with revolvers at their hips. In the forests of Oregon, loggers hunted elk for the winter meat. In every place I went, I saw not fear but familiarity. The weapon was an extension of the hand, a tool like the hammer or the plough. He turned another page, a chart compiled by the embassy before the war. 100 million guns in civilian hands. 100 million. That is nearly one for every man, woman and child. Even if half of these figures are exaggerated, the scale is beyond anything in our empire. The generals looked at each other uneasily. In Japan, the sword had been the symbol of the warrior class, sacred, restricted, controlled. Firearms were rare outside the army or police. To own one without permission was treason. Yet here was a nation where weapons were ordinary household items hung over mantels beside family portraits. Our empire, Yamamoto said, teaches obedience. We have one emperor, one spirit, one army. The Americans, they have 100 million emperors. Each one rules his home. He let the remark hang, then reached into the folder again. This time he produced a single newspaper clipping, yellowed and creased. Do you know their Second Amendment? He asked. No one answered. It is part of their constitution, their sacred law. It states that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. His gaze swept across the room. They have written into law the very thing we forbid, the independence of the citizen. They have legalized resistance. A few officers shifted in their seats. The idea was incomprehensible to them. To the Japanese mind, loyalty to the emperor was absolute, unquestioned. The state defined the citizen. But in America, the citizen defined the state. This, Yamamoto said, tapping the paper, is the reason no foreign power has ever conquered them. They do not rely on the army alone. Their defense begins in every house. He closed the folder gently, almost with reverence. You may destroy their cities, their ships, their airfields, but you cannot occupy their spirit. For every rifle destroyed, another will be handed down, polished, reloaded, and fired again. They are not merely armed, they are prepared. A cold draught slipped through the room as a clerk opened the sliding door. Snow was falling softly outside, muffling the distant sounds of Tokyo. Yamamoto stood and walked toward the window. He looked out at the grey city, neat, ordered, obedient. Here, he said almost to himself, a citizen waits for instruction. There a citizen acts on instinct. The difference, he thought, was as vast as the Pacific. He turned back to the table and bowed his head slightly. Gentlemen, what I saw in America was not luxury or softness. It was power-distributed power that breathes in every small town, every ranch, every apartment above a shop. It is a nation of individuals who do not wait for orders to defend themselves. You cannot invade that. No one argued. The photographs remained scattered across the table, fragments of a foreign world that suddenly seemed far larger and more dangerous than any of them had imagined. Yamamoto gathered his gloves and cap. As he left the room, one of the younger officers whispered to another, "Every home has a rifle." The older man nodded uneasily. Then every hill, every field would be a battlefield. Outside, the snow thickened, erasing footprints within minutes. And in that quiet Tokyo snowfall, Yamamoto knew the truth that no victory parade could hide. Japan had awakened an enemy whose greatest weapon was not built in a factory but kept behind every door. The next session of the Imperial Council was supposed to be routine logistics, shipbuilding targets, convoy routes. But Yamamoto brought with him something no one expected: mathematics. He placed a thin stack of documents on the polished table and spoke in the flat, emotionless tone of an accountant. "These are the numbers," he said, "the numbers that decide whether a war can be won." He opened the first page, an intelligence report compiled by the embassy in Washington before relations collapsed. According to the 1940 United States Census, he began, the population is approximately 132 million. Out of these, more than half are of working age. He paused. And out of those, nearly every household contains at least one firearm. A skeptical voice interrupted. Surely exaggerated. A rifle or two for hunting, perhaps, but not all. Yamamoto nodded. You are correct, General. Not all. Some homes have none, and others have 10. He flipped to a chart printed in English and marked in red pencil. Our observers estimate between 80 and 100 million privately owned guns. Your intelligence bureau confirmed this number before the war. The National Rifle Association counts nearly 1 million registered members who practice marksmanship regularly. And beyond them, there are millions of unregistered shooters, farmers, hunters, factory workers. The civilian marksmanship program, supported by their own government, trains citizens in rifle accuracy. Even their Boy Scouts fire rifles at summer camps. This is not a rumour. It is their policy. He looked up. Their state encourages the citizen to shoot not for war but for sport, but that training cannot be undone when war comes. The room was silent except for the faint hum of a ceiling fan. The reality was sinking in. In the United States, Yamamoto continued, firearms are not limited to the wealthy. In the South, shotguns hang over the doorframes of wooden farmhouses. In the Midwest, fathers and sons rise before dawn to hunt ducks or deer. In the Rockies, men carry rifles as they do walking sticks. In Alaska and Montana, it is survival. A bear or a wolf is a reason to keep a weapon loaded, not locked away. He spread a large map across the table, the outline of the American continent from coast to coast. His hand traced the expanse of land that dwarfed the islands of Japan 100-fold. Imagine, he said, a nation so vast that it takes a week by train to cross it. Imagine trying to conquer it. He pointed to the Appalachians, the long spine of mountains rising from Georgia to Maine. Here, thick forests where visibility is 10 meters at best. Every ridge could conceal a sniper. Every hollow could hold an ambush. His finger moved westward. Then the Mississippi Valley rivers, swamps, bayous. You cannot move armor here without bogging down. The locals know the currents. They live on houseboats and canoes. You would be fighting ghosts. He continued across the plains. Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, 1,000 miles of open farmland. At first you might think easy to cross. But there are no landmarks, no supply routes. Each barn is a fortress. Each windmill a watchtower. A single farmer with a scoped rifle could hold a road for hours. Then the Rocky Mountains, sharp, snow-covered, endless. In these ranges, Yamamoto said softly, you could hide an entire army and never find it. Every hunter there knows the passes better than any invader. The forests are not terrain. They are allies. The general shifted, following his hand westward until it reached the jagged coastline of Oregon and Washington. The Pacific shimmered faintly on the map drawn in blue ink. Suppose Yamamoto said we succeed in landing here. The room held its breath as he began his what-if. Picture our invasion fleet emerging from the fog off Astoria, Oregon, at dawn. The sea is rough. Landing craft scrape against the shore. Hundreds of soldiers rush across the sand, rifles, high bayonets fixed. He paused, and waiting for them no American army. Only silence. A farmhouse in the distance. A barn. A line of trees. Then he lowered his voice. But in those trees there are eyes. A farmer with a Springfield rifle. A forest ranger with a .30-06. A dozen men from the local hunting lodge who know every ravine, every shortcut through the woods. They do not wait for orders. They act. He turned a page of his report. Within the first hour we would lose men to unseen fire. Within a day our supply trucks would burn. Within a week the fog would hide only ghosts' hours. The vision was chilling in its simplicity. He stood back and looked at the entire map again. Our empire is small, he said. Our islands are defended by cliffs and courage. But theirs is defended by distance, by wilderness, by a people who belong to the land itself. If we try to occupy it, the land will fight us. One general muttered something about Japanese discipline overcoming any obstacle. Yamamoto's reply was quiet but final. Discipline cannot shorten an ocean. It cannot melt a mountain nor quiet 1,000,000 rifles fired from behind the trees. He gestured toward the Pacific Ocean that separated the two nations, an expanse so wide that even radio waves took seconds to cross. From Tokyo to San Francisco is 5,000 miles. Every bullet, every grain of rice, every replacement soldier would have to travel that distance. They would face submarines, storms, and air patrols. Meanwhile, Americans would fight in their backyards. Their factories are within shouting distance of their battlefields. Every setback for us is a continent for them. The reality was merciless arithmetic. He turned away from the map and closed his notebook. You see numbers, he said, but I see people. 100 million people who already live with a rifle within reach, spread across a land that devours invaders. Gentlemen, it is not only that we would lose, it is that we would vanish. The room stayed still. The paper maps rustled faintly in the draft. Even the most aggressive officers avoided his eyes. Outside Tokyo's streets buzzed with parades and banners declaring victory. But inside that room, for the first time, the Empire's leaders stared into the abyss their ambition had opened. In America, the land itself had chosen its defenders, mountains, forests, rivers, and the citizens who knew every inch of them. Yamamoto saw it clearly if a war ever crossed the Pacific. Japan would not be fighting a nation. It would be fighting the earth. The next day, the council reconvened. Cigarette smoke curled above the long oak table, and the map of the Pacific lay open like a wound. The generals came armed with defiance. Admiral Yamamoto, one began, you exaggerate. Our navy dominates the Pacific. Our spirit will cross the ocean. Japan has never lost a war at sea. Yamamoto waited for silence. His expression was calm, but his eyes dark. Tired betrayed the weight of what he carried. Spirit, he said evenly as a wind. It can fill sails, but not fuel tanks. A few officers glanced at one another, uncertain if he was mocking them. He continued, let us speak not of courage, but of distance. Tokyo to San Francisco, 5,000 miles. Yokosuka to Seattle, over 4,500. That means every bullet, every bag of rice, every litre of fuel must travel through waters now hunted by American submarines. He reached into his briefcase and unfolded a new chart. Gentlemen, these are US ship production estimates gathered by our intelligence before December. I advise you to sit down. The chart listed numbers so large they seemed impossible. Liberty ships were launched every 3 days in 1942, every day by 1943. Boeing aircraft, hundreds of B-17 and B-24 bombers, rolling out monthly from Seattle and Wichita. Detroit Arsenal tank plant completed a new M4 Sherman every hour at full capacity. Willow Run Factory, Michigan, turning out one B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. Yamamoto let the paper fall to the table. While we build one ship, they build 10. While we pray for rubber, they pave their streets with it. While our pilots die for lack of fuel, theirs train with tanks full and spare. A general slammed his fist on the table. Then we must strike fast, destroy their industry before it wakes. Yamamoto's tone remained calm. You think it sleeps? It does not. You have awakened it. He pointed to the calendar pinned on the wall. Already their automobile plants are converting. General Motors, Ford, Chrysler all retooling for war. Their factories stretch for miles, powered by rivers of oil and fed by iron from Minnesota coal from Pennsylvania, and grain from Kansas to feed their workers. Even as we speak, they are drafting not men but machines. The youngest officer in the room, barely 30, spoke hesitantly. But Admiral, our pilots are superior. Our Zero fighters outmatch theirs. Yamamoto nodded slowly. For now. But what happens when they learn faster than we can replace our dead? He turned toward the window, his silhouette framed against the grey Tokyo sky. We train our airmen for years. They train theirs in months. And they have hundreds of airfields, thousands of instructors, and fuel enough to waste in practice. Do you know how many of our trainees crashed last year for lack of gasoline 58? Not from combat training. The room fell quiet. The numbers were merciless. Yamamoto continued, voice lower now, almost weary. Courage cannot substitute for oil. You cannot fly bravery into battle. You cannot feed soldiers on honor alone. The Americans, for all their luxury, understand that war is logistics. They have turned production into art. We have turned sacrifice into habit. He moved to the map, tracing the Pacific with his finger. Let us imagine as you wish that we land on their coast. You will need at minimum 500,000 men to hold even a strip of territory. Each man must eat 2 pounds of food a day. That is 500 tons daily shipped over this ocean. He tapped the blue expanse between Japan and America. One convoy sunk and 10,000 men starve. Every wave becomes a grave. He turned back toward them. We cannot feed ourselves without imports from Southeast Asia. How will we feed an army across an ocean patrolled by submarines? The Americans will hunt our convoys like sharks. We have already lost half of our merchant fleet before a single soldier lands on their shore. Another general murmured, "We have our submarines as well." Yamamoto's reply was quiet but cutting. They are brave men, yes, but our submarines hunt ships. Theirs hunt empires. He let the silence stretch. The men could hear the faint ticking of the clock, the soft murmur of a distant radio outside playing a patriotic march. Then he said something that froze the room. By 1944, they will outproduce us in every category: aircraft, tanks, ammunition, even ships to carry their ships. We will be fighting the tide itself. A colonel scoffed. You assume too much of them, Admiral. Yamamoto turned. No, I have seen them. I have walked their factories. I have seen a woman in overalls welding steel faster than a team of our labourers. I have seen teenagers assembling engines by the thousands. They work 12-hour shifts and sing while doing it. They have made labour a kind of patriotism. He paused, remembering the faces of those American workers in Detroit, Cleveland, and Seattle, faces smeared with soot but smiling with pride. They do not tire, gentlemen. They believe their machines will win, and they are right. The oldest general in the room finally spoke, his voice thin. You have no faith in our spirit. Admiral Yamamoto met his eyes. I have faith in reality. Spirit cannot cross the Pacific with an empty fuel tank. He gathered the reports and stacked them neatly. The Empire's courage is not in question. But courage is not arithmetic. Courage does not refill a ship's coal. Courage does not replace an engine destroyed in battle. We can fight bravely and still lose completely. He straightened his uniform. Gentlemen, what you call victory would be suicide written slowly in supply forms and ration cards. No one replied. The heater clicked faintly as its oil burned low. Outside, the evening wind howled through the eaves of the War Ministry. Yamamoto stood at the window watching the paper lanterns sway below in the street, bright against the darkening sky, fragile as hope. He knew what the others refused to see. Japan's strength lay in the courage of its warriors, but America's strength lay in the relentlessness of its machines, and machines, unlike men, never tired, never slept, and never doubted. When he finally spoke again, it was almost a whisper. Even the bravest pilot cannot fight the storm of factories that await him. That night, Yamamoto couldn't sleep. Tokyo was quiet, wrapped in blackout curtains, but his mind was loud with the voices of history. The council's arguments still echoed: honor, conquest, glory, destiny. But in his thoughts, another rhythm beat beneath them, the American heartbeat. He lit a cigarette and stared out over the dark city. Below him, soldiers marched in the distance, their boots striking perfect rhythm discipline forged into sound. He knew that rhythm well. It was the rhythm of obedience. Japan's greatness, its tragedy, had always been built on it. The Empire's unity was its pride, and yet he thought unity without question becomes blindness. When he had lived in the United States, he had been struck by something utterly foreign to the Japanese spirit disorder that somehow produced strength. He remembered sitting in the back of a small-town meeting hall in Vermont, watching farmers argue with their mayor about road repairs and school budgets. They raised their voices, interrupted, accused each other of waste, and then astonishingly voted together. The debate ended with laughter and handshakes. To Yamamoto, it had been chaos. But it was also something miraculous, a people who could disagree without dividing. He took a slow drag of his cigarette. They argue because they own their freedom, he thought. They fight because it is theirs to lose. When the generals had scoffed at the idea of armed civilians, Yamamoto had wanted to remind them that America itself had been born from civilians with rifles. The farmers of Lexington and Concord, men in wool coats and worn boots, had stood against the most powerful army on earth. The British Empire had marched in perfect formation. The Americans fired from behind trees and stone walls. Spirit met structure, and spirit had won. He whispered the name to himself, Minutemen. The word itself had fascinated him back in Harvard. Ordinary men ready to fight at a minute's notice. Not because an emperor commanded them, but because they had chosen to. He exhaled, watching smoke curl toward the ceiling. They don't fight for an emperor, he murmured. They fight for the land beneath their boots. In Japan, Bushido, the way of the warrior, taught that honor was service to one's lord. A soldier's life belonged to the emperor. Death for him was the highest calling. But in America, Yamamoto had sensed a different kind of Bushido loyalty, not to a man, but to an idea, liberty. Their code was written not in calligraphy, but in constitutions, in newspapers, in the stubborn pride of the individual. He remembered visiting a printing press in Philadelphia, where a journalist had shown him how the daily paper was made. The man's hands were stained with ink. Freedom of the press, he'd said with a grin, is how we keep our leaders honest. The phrase had stayed with Yamamoto, strange and dangerous citizens who questioned their rulers and were praised for it. In Japan, such a man would vanish. In America, he became famous. How does one defeat a people who are not afraid to question themselves, Yamamoto wondered. How do you crush a nation that grows stronger from argument? He thought of the Civil War, brother against brother, and how the country had nearly destroyed itself, only to emerge more unified. The Americans fought their own, bled their own, and yet refused to die. Their resilience was not discipline but reinvention. They could lose cities and presidents and still rebuild because their power did not come from hierarchy. It came from the stubborn belief that tomorrow could be better. He remembered a dinner in Washington years before the war. A US senator had raised a toast to the Republic. Messy, loud, but unbreakable. The room had laughed. Yamamoto had not. Now those words haunted him. He could still see those same Americans in his mind, the farmer cleaning his shotgun, the factory worker tightening a bolt, the student arguing politics over coffee. None of them looked like warriors. And yet he knew every one of them could become one if forced to defend their home. Every man his own commander, he said quietly. If Japan ever landed on their shores, there would be no surrender line, no palace to seize. The Empire's armies would find themselves lost in a maze of resistance, not from uniformed soldiers, but from the people themselves. It was a terrifying inversion of everything. The Imperial Army believed that wars were won by hierarchy, by divine order, by command from above. But America's defense would come from below, from the earth upward. He thought again of Bushido, its beauty and its curse. The Japanese warrior would die gladly for duty. The American would live stubbornly for freedom. Which was stronger in the long run? His cigarette had burned to the filter. He crushed it out slowly. From his window he could just make out the faint lights of the Imperial Palace, their glow softened by winter haze. For centuries Japan had worshipped Order Emperor at the top, citizen at the bottom. But in that order Yamamoto now saw fragility. America's chaos, by contrast, was resilience disguised as disorder. He remembered one evening in New York Harbor years ago, watching a storm roll in over the skyline. Lightning split the sky above the Statue of Liberty. The Americans around him had barely noticed. She's seen worse, one had said, casually nodding toward the statue. Yamamoto had smiled, then not understanding. Now he did. The statue was more than a monument, it was a mirror. It embodied a faith not in government or empire, but in the endurance of the individual. As dawn crept into the Tokyo sky, Yamamoto finally sat down and wrote a note in his private journal, a thought that had no place in official records. The strength of America lies not in its steel, but in its soul. A people who govern themselves will defend themselves beyond reason. To invade such a land is to fight an idea, and ideas do not die. He closed the notebook, straightened his uniform, and prepared for another day of meetings where no one would listen. Yet he carried with him a quiet respect, not for America's might, but for its contradictions, its arguments, its noise, its impossible unity through freedom. He admired it even as he feared it, for he knew now the most dangerous nation is not the one that obeys, it is the one that believes. The war room was dim, the air thick with smoke and pride. Generals leaned over the great Pacific map spread across the table, red pins marking Japan's new empire Hong Kong, the Philippines, Malaya, Wake Island. The ocean seemed theirs. Cigarettes glowed like embers in a fire pit ash falling onto a port still damp with ink. Outside, Tokyo was celebrating. Bells rang, sake cups clinked, soldiers shouted in the streets. The Empire believed it had humiliated the West. But inside this room, one voice was missing from the chorus of triumph. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood at the far end motionless, his hands clasped behind his back. The Army Chief of Staff turned toward him. "Admiral, the nation rejoices. The blow you planned at Pearl Harbor has crippled the Americans. Their battleships lie in the mud of Oahu. We have dealt them a death they will never recover from." Yamamoto did not answer immediately. He looked down at the photographs spread before him, smoking ships, oil slicks, sailors swimming through blackened water. For a long moment he studied them, as if memorizing the cost. Then softly, "You believe we have crippled them." The generals exchanged uneasy glances. Yamamoto raised his eyes. The glow from a single lamp cast deep shadows across his face. "We have not crippled them. We have awoken them." A pause, long and uncomfortable. Even the ceiling fan seemed to slow. He stepped closer to the table, the faint rasp of his boots the only sound. "You do not know the America I know," he said. "You see a decadent nation, soft and indulgent. I have seen a people who can turn anger into steel." He reached for one of the photographs, the USS Arizona, her hull split open, smoke rising like a funeral pyre. "This," he said, "is not their end. It is their beginning." The room fell silent. The rustle of paper stopped. The smoke from cigarettes curled upward, unmoving. "I tell you this," Yamamoto continued, his voice low but resonant. "In the first 6 months we will run wild. We will take islands, crush fleets, celebrate victories. But after that—" He looked each man in the eye. "After that, I have no expectation of success." The generals stared, stunned. One protested, "Admiral, such talk is defeatist. The Emperor expects." Yamamoto cut him off with a raised hand. "I have served His Majesty all my life. I will continue to. But honour does not blind me to arithmetic." He turned away from them, walking slowly toward the window. Beyond the frosted glass, the snow fell soundlessly over Tokyo. "I studied at Harvard. I lived among them. I know their hearts," he said. "Once they decide upon war, they will fight not as an army, but as a nation. You cannot measure that with ships or bombs." Then came the words that would outlive him. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." The phrase hung in the air like a tolling bell. No one spoke. A cigarette burned itself out on the table, the smoke rising in a thin white ribbon toward the ceiling. The maps beneath it, the Pacific, the Aleutians, the coast of California, seemed to darken under the lamplight. Outside, the bells of celebration kept ringing faint through the snow. Yamamoto remained by the window for a long time, hands behind his back staring at the faint glow of the palace lanterns. He thought of America's open fields, the long highways stretching across the continent, the men and women he had met in Kansas factories and California shipyards. He knew what those people could do when anger replaced apathy. He thought of the telegrams already being written across the Pacific, mothers learning their sons had died in Hawaii, fathers gripping the newspaper headlines, factories beginning to buzz with outrage. Within hours, President Franklin D. Roosevelt would speak before Congress. The world would hear his words, a date which will live in infamy. And from that moment, Yamamoto's nightmare would take shape. Factories that once made cars would pour out tanks and bombers. Women who had never touched machinery would fill assembly lines welding steel in the glow of midnight sparks. Students, clerks, and farmers would line up at recruiting stations. The American people, those same citizens Yamamoto had described, would turn grief into production, sorrow into unity. Across the Pacific, Japan would celebrate each victory, unaware that with every island captured, the ocean itself was turning against them. The sleeping giant was stirring. Its heartbeats were factories. Its breath was smoke. Its fists were ships built faster than Japan could sink them. Yamamoto returned to his desk and wrote in his private journal that night, "The Empire rejoices. I feel only dread. To destroy a man's navy is one thing. To unite his spirit, that is another." He stared at the ink as it dried dark and final. For a long time he simply sat listening to the quiet. He was no traitor. He was a patriot, one of the few who understood that patriotism without foresight is suicide dressed as duty. He would obey the emperor. He would lead Japan's fleets. And when the tide turned, when Midway burned, when carriers sank, when the vast sky filled with American planes, he would remember this night and know it had begun here. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the streets in silence. The city slept unaware of the storm it had summoned. Yamamoto turned off the lamp, the room fading into darkness. In that stillness his words lingered, not a prophecy but a lament. The sleeping giant was awake. History would prove Yamamoto right with a precision as cold as mathematics. Japan never invaded the American mainland. The bold dreams of conquest that had once filled the war rooms of Tokyo dissolved into cautious maps of defense. Even when their empire stretched across the Pacific from Burma to the Gilberts, the line toward California remained empty, a frontier no general dared to cross. And yet, in the distant north, they tried. In June 1942, Japanese troops landed on the Aleutian Islands, the far windlash chain stretching from Alaska into the Bering Sea. It was meant to be symbolic, a foothold on American soil proof that the empire could strike anywhere. But the islands themselves turned on them. Fog swallowed the ships, supply lines froze, the terrain consumed the soldiers. When US forces counterattacked, the Japanese fought to the last man not in glory, but in isolation. By 1943, the Aleutian experiment had ended in disaster. Even the frozen rocks refused to host a foreign flag. Yamamoto never lived to see it. In April 1943, he was shot down over Bougainville during an inspection tour, ambushed by American P-38s, guided by decoded radio intercepts. The man who had foreseen his nation's fate was killed by the very precision and technology he had admired. His wreckage lay in the jungle surrounded by twisted steel and silence, a symbol of his prophecy fulfilled. But his warnings echoed long after he was gone. By 1945, Japan faced the very nightmare Yamamoto had predicted, an enemy vast beyond comprehension. American industry had become a weaponized ecosystem. B-29 bombers darkened the skies over Tokyo. Liberty ships crossed the Pacific in endless convoys. The empire that once believed spirit could conquer machinery was drowning in machinery it could not match. And yet, even in the shadow of defeat, Japan planned its final stand. The strategy was Operation Ketsugo, a defense plan so desperate it bordered on national suicide. Every soldier, every schoolchild, every grandmother with a bamboo spear was to fight to the death. The beaches would be lined with explosive traps. Kamikaze pilots would throw their lives against the invasion fleet. The generals promised the emperor that 10 million deaths would buy honor. Across the ocean, the Americans prepared their answer, Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan's home islands. Their projections were staggering up to 1 million Allied casualties, perhaps 10 times as many Japanese. It would have been the bloodiest operation in human history. Neither side would ever carry it out. The atomic bomb made sure of that. When Hiroshima and Nagasaki vanished in fire, the war ended not with the clash of armies, but with the silence of understanding, the realization that Yamamoto's warning had been larger than strategy. He had not only predicted military defeat, he had foreseen a truth about civilization itself, that power without restraint destroys its own purpose. Japan surrendered. The world entered an age where a single weapon could erase nations, and victory became indistinguishable from annihilation. In the decades that followed, historians would call Yamamoto a realist trapped in a myth. His peers saw him as cautious, his enemies remembered him as honorable. But to those who study the war's aftermath, he remained something else, a mirror reflecting the paradox of power. He had understood before anyone else that technology was no longer the servant of ideology. It had become its judge. He had understood that the true cost of arrogance is measured not in territory lost, but in humanity forgotten. From Pearl Harbor's flames to the ashes of Hiroshima, the line of consequence was unbroken. And in between stood the ghost of one man who had tried unsuccessfully to warn his own nation that courage without wisdom leads only to ruin. The world changed after 1945. America emerged as the very giant he had feared, powerful, industrial, unyielding, yet haunted by the moral weight of its weapons. Japan, once the empire of warriors, became a nation of engineers and artisans devoted to peace, yet carrying the memory of its reckoning like a scar. In the end, Yamamoto's prophecy was less about America than about the universal laws of human ambition. Nations rise on vision, but fall on pride. Armies win battles, but wisdom decides survival. The files he left behind would be studied by future generations of officers, not for their tactics, but for their humility. Because hidden between his lines of statistics and strategy was one enduring truth that to understand an enemy is not weakness, but the beginning of wisdom. The war that could have consumed 2 continents ended not in invasion but in surrender. And from that surrender came the quiet rebuilding of both nations, one through forgiveness, the other through reflection. As history faded into memory, Yamamoto's voice seemed to linger in the background of every lesson learned, since that knowledge without humanity leads to destruction and foresight, unheeded becomes tragedy foretold. In the long silence that followed 1945, amid the ruins and the rebirth, the final lesson remained one that outlived the admiral, the empire, and the age of battleships. Sometimes the greatest victory is to know which war not to fight,